Hello, everybody. Welcome to YWCA Paso's Courageous Conversations. This is, I don't even know what number it is, but it's very, very exciting to have you all here today. It is especially important that we have these conversations given what just happened in Buffalo, New York. As we know, racism kills, hate kills, and what happened in Buffalo, New York is eerily similar to what happened in El Paso, where somebody traveled to their communities to kill individuals because of their racist beliefs. And so events like this, courageous conversations like this, are intended to educate and to inform and to provide an opportunity for us to listen to other voices in spaces where they are respected. So I'd like to thank you for joining us here tonight. And I'd like to especially thank Kayla Suarez for diligently and putting these things together, because if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't be having these courageous conversations. So thank you, Kayla, for your work on this. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my very good friend who I absolutely respect and love, and who has been just really excited about bringing this conversation forward. So with that, I don't know if many of you know Dr. Ann Horak. She's a professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, and she focuses on women, gender studies, and religious studies. And so she has served as the chair of the Racial Justice Committee, which is now the Social Equity Committee at the YWCA for several years, and just recently was on that committee and was actually named to serve on the board of YWCA USA. So with that, I want to turn it over to my dear friend, Dr. Ann Horak, who will be moderating this conversation. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you so much, Dr. Costa. Thank you, Kayla, for all that you do at the YWCA. And thanks to everybody for joining us. I am very excited about tonight. I love our Courageous Conversation series. If you've missed any of them, you can go to our homepage and find that link and watch them. We've covered a variety of topics. And tonight is another really interesting topic from my good friend, Dr. Jonna Perrillo, who is an English education professor and the director of UTEP's English education program, but she also focuses on educational history. And probably many people don't even realize that that's a field, but it is, because we know that how students are taught, the curriculum that they're taught, the book selection, what the values of a school are, what type of student they're trying to create, all of that is actually really fascinating history. So that's what Jonna studies, and her work has been published in many prestigious magazines like American Quarterly, and also magazines like Time Magazine and the Washington Post. This is her second book, and this particular branch of educational history that she's going to share with us tonight is El Paso. It is local. It's a part of El Paso history that you may not have known about at all, or you may have known a little bit about, but didn't really completely understand how it played out. How in her book, Educating the Enemy, she talks about the families who were members of the Nazi Party who right after the end of World War II were brought to El Paso, and specifically those children, those 144 children who were part of Operation Paperclip. So Dr. Perrillo is such an important part of the UTEP community, also of the El Paso community, along with her family. And so to have her here today to share with us this interesting history, I think we're all going to enjoy it. While we're talking, we are going to have some time at the end, about 20 minutes at the end, for your questions. And so while we're talking, if something comes into your mind, you don't have to wait until the end. Go ahead and type that question into the chat, and then we'll have time to get to it. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jonna, and take it away and tell us about this book and about this fascinating local history that it covers.
Thanks, Ann. Everyone can hear me okay? I assume. Okay, great. So thanks to begin with to Sylvia, Anne, and Kayla for organizing this and for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm really happy to be here. People who know me have heard me say that Anne is just my model of community engagement and has taught me so much about how to be engaged in various parts of the El Paso community. And so it's really special for me to be here and talking with her tonight. I also want to thank Literary Books for making the book so available. And I know a lot of you have gotten it there, and I appreciate that partnership as well. So I'm going to start by sharing a slideshow here. Some of you all have seen some of these images before and heard me talk about the book before. And I'm just going to spend the next 20 minutes or so doing that, and maybe doing a little bit of an interactive historical exercise with us. If we'll see if we get to that or not, and then we'll open it up to conversation with Anne, which I'm really looking forward to. So she said it really, really well. My book is the story of the 144 children who came to the United States in 1946 as part of Operation Paperclip, which was a military operation that brought Nazi scientists who had built the V-2 missile for the Third Reich to the US and to El Paso specifically to build a missile for the US Army. Each of those scientists was allowed to bring officially up to 3 family members. Some brought more, some brought less. But those 144 school-age children started to arrive in 1946 and 1947. And even though they lived behind barbed wire at Fort Bliss, they were bused daily to El Paso public schools. And I compare their experiences in El Paso schools with the Mexican-American students who made up the majority of the El Paso school population. And at its heart, the book is a story about race, about segregation, education inequity, and about a patriotic curriculum that was frequently more welcoming to the children of fascists than it was to native-born El Paso citizens. So to explain how this works, I just invite us to look at these 2 images here. So schools for Mexican-American students, which were largely concentrated in South El Paso, were called Mexican schools. And this wasn't specific just to El Paso, it was nomenclature used across the Southwest. And schools for white students, Anglo students, were called American schools. And so I start here because this says so much already about citizenship and about the ways in which schools thought about who they were educating. From this difference in nomenclature stemmed or flowed a number of other differences between Southside schools and Northside schools here in El Paso, including material resources, everything from buildings. So buildings in the South Side, some lacked cafeterias, some lacked libraries. Many were so overcrowded that students were taking classes in hallways or in auditoriums, with many classes in a single auditorium. It also, other kinds of material resources were different too, textbooks. Teacher relationships with students was often very different. All but 17 of the teachers in El Paso at this time were Anglo. Most did not speak Spanish, right? So that really sort of framed relationships between teachers and students, and sometimes teacher enthusiasm for their students and their job. And there were important curricular differences, which I'll talk about in a bit as well. So my ability to write this book depended on interviews with about 20 former paperclip children and some El Pasoans too, although I also depended on the Institute for Oral History at UTEP for local, for Mexican-American interviews, local Mexican-American interviews. But children, I argue in this book, other historians have written about Operation Paperclip, and I would be happy to recommend books for folks who are interested in learning more about it. But I argue that actually the children were the most important part of the operation because they immediately became these public relations tools, the symbol of the operation, to make what was a controversial program far more palatable to the American public, starting with the El Paso public. Images were an important part of that work. These were images that were shared with me with a former child, and I have all the images in here of the paperclip children come from former paperclip children, but they were reproduced in newspapers, and they looked the part, right? They looked like how white Americans thought of themselves. And so it was important public relations work. I want to say too that I depended on oral histories with them because they weren't in the archives, even though I called on archives from really all over the country and spent a month all told at the National Archives. The children, for as important as they were for putting a happy face on the operation, were often absent in the materials, which is not totally unusual for people who do history of childhood. So it depended in a lot of ways on conversations that I was able to have with these children. And I think that's really apt tonight, since we're talking about courageous conversations. Not all of my interviews were particularly courageous, but some really were. I didn't, this book isn't about their parents, but it is about white supremacy, and it is about fascism. And we had some conversations about that. And I really appreciate those conversations. And I'll say a little bit more about them later. So one of the things that I really look at in this book is the ways in which schools were segregated and how school zoning policies made them even more segregated than the neighborhoods in which they were located, which themselves were often racially and economically segregated. So students from South El Paso, and that's really south of this line, this bold-faced line that we're looking at here, were only allowed to transfer north of that line if they were Anglo. And students north of the line were only allowed to transfer south to schools south of it if they were Spanish, or as some documents put it, or Mexican American. And so I showed this was designed to make schools, even more racially segregated than they already were. And in fact, to sort of prepare or inform city politics more largely. So for example, when Burleson parents complained that their students were taking classes in hallways, and that the school that we now call Mesita, that was then called Dudley, got an improvement or an addition before they did, the superintendent of the schools called them communists and walked out of the room and shut down the meeting. So schools were segregated by design, and that was just an important sort of foundation for setting up larger city political systems. I look too at sort of space and how space structured social interactions in the city more largely. So obviously El Paso was a Jim Crow city. And so some of these rules, that law applied only to African Americans, right? And so white El Pasoans used space in other ways, like the sort of school policy that I was just talking about, to segregate Mexican Americans who weren't covered by Jim Crow. And I look at that in the book, but I just was, I really love these two pool pictures. Almost everyone I interviewed talked about the pool at Fort Bliss. It was a really important place, I would imagine, for people who had just come from Germany and probably experienced heat there that they had just not really been able to imagine before. But I was really struck by this memory of Helga Chinkel, who said, we'd make a daily trek to the swimming pool where we'd mix with the American soldiers who also lived on the base. They're very friendly to us, and I remember getting tossed from one to another through the air. And this was an interesting recollection to me, supported by some others, both in terms of so these people who are tossing them in the air were likely just fighting in World War II. There were a number of veterans. probably in any social situation that they were in on base. But also these had to have been white soldiers, because African-American soldiers were only allowed to use the pool at Fort Bliss the day before it was drained. So this is already sort of inviting these German children into a community of whiteness and to really an identity of whiteness that just every part of their lives in El Paso entrenches and reiterates. And so I also look at housing policy, just because it's hard to think about schools and segregation without also thinking about housing policy when you're not talking about Jim Crow. And just to give you a sense of what things were like, in 1940, half of the housing in the Segundo Barrio, or in South El Paso more largely, lacked indoor toilets or private bathrooms. So poverty was dire. South El Paso dealt with a lot of situations in terms of health and in terms of community health that stemmed from that poverty. The picture that we're looking at here was taken, the one at the Segundo Barrio was taken by a photographer named Russell Lee, who was commissioned by a sociologist named Lyle Saunders, who was really focused on documenting segregation and inequity against Mexican Americans in Texas, and asked Russell Lee to create a series of photographs that captured both the segregationist nature that Mexican Americans experienced living in El Paso, but also their sense of aspiration. And I think this is a really interesting photo to compare to that of the paperclip children reading comic books out on the lawn outside of the barracks in which they lived. And sort of starts to give us some insight into the social lives of these children outside of school that then get sort of changed and shaped further within school. So, and I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes when I talk about the language curriculum, but I do look at two different aspects of the curriculum that I think are especially important when we think about citizenship values. And the first of those is social studies. And particularly, I focus on sort of teachings about cowboys and Indians, which was really popular nationally in social studies instruction, but which had a sort of regionalist sort of flair to it here in El Paso. And really, cowboys were taught to teach a host of democratic values that were supposed to both come easily to Anglo children, but also Anglo children were supposed to embrace, including industry, self-reliance, individual responsibility, leadership, and really ideas about Western civilization that you can't divorce from ideas about white supremacy from the time. So this is amazing that Henry Chinkle had this photo, had still this school project that he did at Crockett Elementary in 1947. But I thought it was really interesting because largely the role of this curriculum was to erase Native Americans. They were considered important in the curriculum in that they set up cowboys, right? So cowboys were considered to have also this sort of relationship to the land that they learned from Native Americans. And so they sort of became surrogate Native Americans in a lot of ways. And Native Americans themselves were either ignored or sort of presented in very particular ways. But I'll say that like El Paso children at Crockett went on field trips to all sorts of ranches in the area, but they had no contact with local Native Americans as they might have. And that to me was pretty symbolic of the sort of curriculum more largely. The German children, the paperclip children, were primed in a lot of ways to embrace the role that cowboys played in juvenile culture more largely in the United States, in part because they were educated to imagine the United States in this way, both by their parents, who grew up with an affinity for cowboy and Indian stories themselves. They were really popular in Germany, but also by the US Army, which would show the children and their mothers while they waited in Bavaria to be transported to the United States. Their fathers came over before them. They would show them these Western films as a way of getting ready to move to the United States. This picture of Bern Sealer down in the bottom right corner is of he and his younger brother and his father the day that he got to El Paso. He arrived El Paso, that's them in front of their barracks, and his father awaited them with those cowboy outfits. So these narratives were really popular for parents as well. I just love this, the photographs, but also the caption written probably by their father assimilating himself as Texan. So Buffalo Bill had toured in Germany often. Karl May was a really important German, and incredibly popular German writer who was sort of like a James Fenimore Cooper knockoff. He wrote stories of the American West, but the white people were German, and he had actually not been to the United States when he wrote the books. But they were drawn to these arguments, Germans were, and Hitler actually told the Nazi Teachers Association that they should teach these books by Karl May, because Germans, by and large, and I would say Nazis more specifically, found in these stories of United States colonialism and Western expansion, a model that they really liked of thinking about Europe and thinking about the ways in which they might imagine themselves as expanding across the continent of Europe, which was, I think, as we all know, the Third Reich's part of their goal. Then the other part of the curriculum that I look at is language. And everything about, so most Mexican-American students came to El Paso public schools speaking very little to no English, because their lives were so segregated. By and large, they had very little, very few like sort of authentic encounters with English before they started school. The Germans shared this. They also didn't speak English. Some of the scientists did, a couple of the mothers did, but most of the community really didn't. And the children, most of them were too young to even attend school in Germany, and certainly didn't learn English there. So one of the things I look at is how differently German and Mexican American children were taught English. And, it doesn't take a historian to tell an El Pasoan that Mexican American students were beaten, given demerits, suspended, otherwise punished for speaking Spanish in school. This is something that so many people know from just family history. It was a different model entirely for the German students, who were never hit, even though corporal punishment was, as they talked about, a part of their family culture and German culture. These are pictures of them learning English in an intensive summer school class that teachers, I can't remember what school she taught for, an El Paso teacher who offered to teach them along with two others. So they were given a chance to learn English intensively. They were given ice cream for speaking English instead of German. So it was a really different model of thinking about how to treat these children and how to teach them English. And then Spanish was actually already a part of elementary school instruction here at this time as well. And I include these books here, which my friend Gaineth, who I think is here tonight, gave to me because I think they capture the ways in which Spanish acquisition for Anglo students was imagined, which is to say Spanish was imagined to be useful for Anglo students so that they could hire and direct Mexican and Mexican Americans in their homes and in the workplace. And so I can talk more about this later, but to me, this was a really interesting part of this history because so many of us, I think now, are familiar with the dual language programs here in El Paso, and they have a longer history than we might realize. So the last chapter in the book is about one of the paperclip wives, and actually another hugely important member of the group, because she was a Montessori teacher and really a leader of the German Montessori movement in Berlin until Hitler banned Montessori schools in 1936. And then she went to work for the Nazi Party and became a leader in the Women's Nazi Party. And I end the book with her because she claimed all along that she only cared about children, that she wasn't political, that her teaching wasn't political. But in fact, I think she pushes us to think about a strand of progressive education that at this time, both in Germany and the United States, was tied to racial politics, which is to say, I think that she gives us a way of thinking about American teachers at this time as well, who I'm not saying were fascist, but I am saying were racist in a lot of cases. And the book has a lot of documentation of that, both in terms of curriculum the teachers wrote, but just also in how they talked about their students. And what it means to be part of racist institutions, right? And sort of one's own sort of complicity in working for institutions and having to toe the line. Schools, my book shows, did a lot of work for El Paso society in terms of keeping sort of cementing the racial status quo in the city, and could not be divorced from the economic and political life of adults in the city. So I wanted to sort of bring these two quotes in. So in this case, I interviewed the grandchildren of this woman, Ywca Oxter, both of whom live in Europe. So it was all by email. But I'm just going to read these two quotes because I think they're really fascinating and also a way of thinking about courageous conversations. So Lily, the oldest grandchild, says, "I'm not at all afraid about my grandmother's name to be dragged through the mud. Ywca Oxter was a heavy Nazi, and there's nothing that should be held back, no matter whether she was involved in the Montessori movement." And then her younger brother, Felix, said, "What I want to say, I don't doubt that my grandmother was terrible. At the same time, my brothers and sisters as well, began to question her function within our family memory. Blaming her was a way for my grandfather to whitewash himself and his Nazi entanglements." And so I think there was a lot of whitewashing happening around Operation Paperclip, and that the children were an important part of this. But I guess I just want to say it's people like Lily and Felix that made this book in some ways possible, and their willingness to talk about difficult histories and histories that I think, they wanted to talk about, but weren't easy necessarily because they were so personal. And I think in a lot of ways, that's a metaphor for the book and for maybe our potential relationship to this story in some ways as El Pasoans who are living the legacy of this story in various ways I think Anne and I will talk about. So I'm going to just end here on this slide, but I'm going to say, I think it's really, so this is one of the images that when I was talking about PR campaign, this is from a newspaper in early 1947, and it's of Barbara Angle of Germany, of Operation Paperclip, and Catherine Graves, and the caption is "Girlish Secrets Know No National Barriers." Well, Barbara didn't actually speak English at the time that this photo was taken. I interviewed her sister, and she said that she didn't speak English, and that this time was actually incredibly difficult for her when she came, just leaving a war-torn country, but also leaving everything that she knew. And so it's a really nice reminder of the ways in which children of all types across El Paso were used in this movement to tell El Pasoans stories about the success of their schools as democratic institutions, as places that prepared children to serve as democratic citizens, and as places that could decide who deserved the most citizenship values or who deserved the greatest amount of social citizenship. I'm just going to end with this one quote that was sent to me after a piece on my book in Time magazine. It came from New York. And it was by an African-American woman named Lorraine Fowles, who wrote, "During World War II, when one of my brothers was in the army in Oklahoma, the USO came to put on a show. The Black soldiers were not allowed in and watched the show from the outside fence, while seated inside was a row of German war prisoners. That brother went on to fight in the war and earn the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. I can almost hear his voice as he bitterly described the blonde heads of the German prisoners in their front row seats." And so another moment that I think we can kind of come back to and talk about maybe in our conversation, Anne, but I just end here to say, this story, while it's a Borderlands story, and while I especially love talking about it with El Pasoans, seems to resonate for Americans more largely, and has, I think, a lot to offer to Americans who've never been to El Paso, but who nevertheless find some real value in this, in our history and in our story. Okay, I think I'm already a little bit longer than I meant to be, so let's stop there, Anne.
Yes, no, this is great. It's so fascinating and interesting. And what I want to do now is ask you a couple of questions And then we're going to open it up to everybody else. So again, if you have questions, don't wait. Go ahead and type them into the chat so that we can be collecting those and be ready for those. But Jonna, when you say things like, children are used to tell us stories about ourselves, that's something I really want to return to and make a connection to today. But before we get there, I want to delve just a little bit deeper into some of the content in the book. I found the whole cowboy culture really fascinating, and that photo you showed was one that I loved. And I was reading the book, and what the paperclip child had written underneath it: father assimilating himself as Texan. What a fascinating insight, right? So it wasn't just cowboy culture writ large, it was also Texas culture. And still today, students in Texas say the Pledge of Allegiance to the Texas flag, and many Utah professors who move here from other states, when their kids go to school for the first time, they say, what on earth is going on? They learn Texas history in fourth grade and seventh grade, again in high school. What specific Texas history was being taught to these Germans? And what do you think was that part of the whitewashing, or was that part of the assimilating? What was going on with this specifically Texas history?
Yeah, I think that's great. A great question. And there's a quote in the book by one of the former children who says, I think we can imagine the Texas history. They were taught about the Alamo. They were taught about Davy Crockett. They were taught about the people who our schools are named after in some cases, right? And what one of the older children said, there were a few who had experienced some schooling who were older elementary when they came here. And Henry Chinkle said, it felt a lot like the way I was actually taught German history. It was really chauvinistic, it was really nationalist, and it was really the same story with different people in it. And that's an example of something that I just thought was really, I appreciated that candor and that ability to see that. But yeah, that's what they're taught. I was actually thinking of Chuck when I went back and looked at old newspapers from Fort Bliss to see what was playing in the cinema, and it was all westerns and war movies and whatever rom-coms or something. But yeah, tons of westerns, right? And so this is such an important thing for just white America, I think, at the time, and such a huge part of cultural literacy, but it became theirs as well. And that's also how they learned these sort of myths of Texas and the West.
And I wonder if it helped them become the good guys again, because they had been the bad guys, and now they're in America with the good guys from World War II, in quotes, and they wanted to become the good guys now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It helped them to, I think, rewrite themselves into American culture in a lot of ways. And, they talk about eating porcupine, which I've never heard of anyone doing that, but apparently once someone did. But yeah, it gave them something to hook onto, a part of American culture that was both familiar to them from Germany, but also really appealing. And I think, that's part of the importance of them landing in El Paso, right? Had they gone to, I don't know, New York or Ohio or something, right? That would have been a little bit different, but they fully expected to show up here and to see cowboys roaming the streets, and talked about in several of the children gave me their parents' memoirs. And the children themselves remember thinking that's what they were going to see when they came here, and being kind of disappointed that they were in a city. Yeah. And
as you point out at the book, it's a whitewashing of Texas cowboy culture, which actually at the time was a lot of Mexican vaqueros, was not all white people as cowboys.
That's right. That's right.
And there's a lot of African-American cowboys. Cowboy culture has always been very diverse in reality.
Right. And actually, the social studies curriculum was one of the more uniform parts of the curriculum. So I looked at old newspapers, because they would have, cowboy and cowgirl dress up day, or they would have class trips where they would go outside and eat picnics and sing ranch songs and things like this, these sort of performances of Westernness. And this happened at schools across the city. So it was more uniform than the language instruction in that sense, but you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought that up, that, yeah, Mexican Americans were taken out of this history other than as rebels, right?
Right. So let's talk about this whole idea, because the specific things you're describing happened in the past, but the general ideas we are still absolutely dealing with today. That idea of shaping children, and I love what you said at the beginning of your talk, that children are public relation tools. And if we want to scare people, and if we want to make a point, we talk about what is happening to our children, right? So today, we hear those same things, trying to protect our children, trying to, with banned book conversations, with critical race theory, with social and emotional learning. And you've done a lot, you spent your career studying educational history. What are some of the parallels that you see today? What are some of the things you hear being discussed today that just bring you back to the topics of the past?
Well, like in the Cold War, I think we're in this moment of deep racial and cultural anxiety, political anxiety, right? That's getting acted out through schools and is trying to be enforced through schools. White anxiety, for lack of a better term, and white supremacy. I mean, this is taking a lot of different forms right now. Some of it's racial, some of it's about sexuality. Even more recently, the entire concept of social and emotional learning seems to be under attack. If we look at like the textbooks that were banned in Florida, most largely, it's almost like empathy is being banned. There's just this real fear of what will happen if Americans are allowed to be empathetic towards each other, and if civil discourse actually is possible. And so we saw how, or I show how, I guess in the book, these paperclip children become symbols of Americanness, right? They show up and they want to say the Pledge of Allegiance. They absolutely love to honor the Texas flag. They love singing the Eyes of Texas at the beginning of every school day. These stories resonate with them, and they say it to the journalists, or the journalists claim that they say it. Mm-hmm. It's so interesting to me that they, when we think about that last stage picture, what was actually said and not said. And then the flip side of that is that Mexican-American students are seen as un-American, as lazy, as asocial, as unwilling to sort of conform or reform themselves. So an important part of how they're taught English is that I look at the sort of sentences that German children are taught to speak, and sentences that Mexican-American children are taught to speak. And they're taught to say things like, I went to the bathroom and washed my hands. I went to the clinic and my nose is runny, or some like things like this that are meant like that. First, they need to be taught how not to be health risks and how not to be sites of contagion. And to me, this is far more about language and is about a perception of these children and what they bring with them and where they belong in the society. And so I do think we're in a moment again where conservatives, radical conservatives are trying to tell children who belongs and who doesn't belong. And it's white children who belong, right? Like any sort of story that threatens to make them uncomfortable or make them anxious or even reflective, is being banned.
And I think what's interesting is, who is being made anxious? Who is being made uncomfortable? Is it the children or is it the adults? And in the story you're telling, you've got two sets of adults. You've got these German adults who were just enemy combatants, literally months ago. And then you have the larger general public. You actually have many different groups. You have the Fort Bliss families who were serving, and then you have the larger general American public. How does that, did you get a sense when you were interviewing these children, were they anxious about these larger issues, or were they just anxious about making new friends and getting to the pool enough?
Right. Well, so, I mean, one of the things about oral history, right, is now there are like 7 decades that have passed. And so we're talking about memory more than history in a lot of ways. And that's not useful, but it's just a little bit of a different thing. But yeah, they talked consistently about being warned, lay low when you get here. You're going to be seen as the enemy. Just be prepared. People are going to hate you. And consistently their memories were being prepared for that and that not being the case at all, and not feeling that at all when they arrived. And so, yeah, they talk about being embraced, and they talk about that sort of sense of being embraced as everything they've been told was true about the United States, that it's so welcoming and so democratic, and it just sort of reinforced their sense of belonging. So that was really shocking, because when I started writing the book, I thought it was going to be about anxiety, the kind of anxiety that we might imagine. What happens when former Nazis show up in a military town? But that wasn't the case at all. But I think your point, to go to your original point, though, I think is absolutely important. We're not listening to children right now. These complaints about guilt and whatever other feelings we're so afraid of them feeling aren't coming from children. They're not even attempting to document this, because I don't think it is about them at all.
Right. And so, and it's interesting the idea of belonging. We see this certainly with refugees, how eager Americans and Europeans are to welcome Ukrainian refugees, which we should. I'm happy that people are doing that, but not at all willing to welcome refugees that don't racially align. It's this idea of whiteness being an identifier that overcomes all other identifiers.
Right.
It overcomes nationality. It overcomes anything else. If you are white, you band together.
Right. It overcomes politics. It overcomes fascism, apparently. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that I really came to see, though, as I was writing the book, is because how much a sense of white belonging in this country was familiar to these Germans, and vice versa. There are so many moments in the book where, white Texans talk about admiring these Germans. And there's a lot of history that I draw on that shows that a fair amount of Nazi law was built on Jim Crow. We were talking about Zyklon B, before the talk started. There was a lot that the Germans learned from the United States. And so there was a certain there was a sense of belonging for them to just plug into, but there was a sense of mutual identification and admiration that's surprising to me, even after having written the book. Even like, it just remains surprising to me how powerful that sense of identification was.
Right, how powerful that, like you said, that white supremacy, how normalized it was and how powerful it was. So we've got lots of other people who want to ask questions. So I'm going to invite Kayla to join us, or Kayla to yes, and bring in some other questions from other people listening.
Yes, so we have some questions, and I've had a couple people text me. So a couple of the questions, Jonna, have to do with how, or if you think that schools or school districts are open to taking these lessons, understanding that this legacy still exists, and becoming transformative institutions that question the history instead of just reinforcing, or, almost as if when you were saying earlier, just assimilating into that status quo.
Well, I certainly think there are many individuals, many individuals who are dedicated to social justice, racial justice, who are teachers out of a sense of those beliefs, right? So I think that there are individuals have changed. I think institutions are harder to change. And I do think our schools are different than they were in the mid-1940s. They're, I think, economically segregated more than racially segregated now. City demographics are a little bit different than they were at that time. So they're not the same, but I don't also think that, we've overcome all of this either. I think when we look at how opportunity is doled out from school to school, it's not always equitable. I've been talking with parents in South El Paso who are really upset that their schools were closed. And, parents whose children go to Douglas School now, which is back to back with a recycling plant, right? That's really dangerous for children. So I don't think we can say that everything has been solved. But my experiences with educators here is that, the thinking about student identity and thinking about citizenship has changed considerably, to put it lightly, and that there are a lot of really wonderful teachers out there who are dedicated to advancement for all of their students.
One that I received, do you think that the reason why the paperclip children were so comfortable with, the Pledge of Allegiance and assimilation is because it was similar to the culture they had grown up in Germany.
Yeah, that's curious. I think that's possible. I think it's also possible they weren't comfortable with it, but they were told to say they were comfortable with it, or that they were just, it was something that they could recognize. Some of these interviews were coming within a month or two of when they were there. It was a part of the curriculum that even if they spoke no English, it was the same every day, right? And so it was just kind of an easy thing to glom onto. So I think for all of those reasons, it probably just felt like familiar to them. It was the one part of the day that was always the same.
And when you mentioned that the students in their interviews, they didn't really feel that they were treated as the enemy. Did you discuss at all if their parents experienced that?
I didn't much. I mean, there are books about their parents that try to get at that a little bit more, and they're just books about the history. So there was a strong movement against them coming here that was led by really prominent rabbis, especially Rabbi Stephen Wise, and also by scientists, including like Jewish scientists like Albert Einstein, but also just scientists who were a little offended that the thought that we needed Germans to do something that American scientists could do. So there was a fair amount of protests and the State Department actually was not behind it. The War Department, this was a War Department initiative, Operation Paperclip, and the State Department had real issues with it. So it was controversial for sure. And so their parents probably experienced I'm sure they experienced some pushback, but they're also, I have quotes by military officers on Fort Bliss who are like, I can't believe this. These guys are running around like they own this place. Mm-hmm. They went to the Plaza Theater one night and were not allowed in because their escort was an African-American soldier. And it wasn't about them, it was about their escort. So there are all sorts of politics and senses of entitlement that are on display and that are really complicated.
We have one asking if you can speak any more about the language teaching disparity from the time.
Yeah, I can. So I'm trying to think of what else. So one disparity that I haven't mentioned at all, I guess, is that Spanish was only taught to Anglo kids in the younger grades until they got to high school. And there were some parents who wanted their children to be taught academic Spanish and who asked for it. And the schools wouldn't do it because their feeling was you spend too much time speaking Spanish already anyways. And I'm not sure the Spanish that they were being taught wasn't being taught for academic reasons. It was being taught for labor reasons, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the sense of white educators was all the Spanish you're going to need to know. So that was a striking difference to me as well. And a real when we think about the dual language, I keep saying dual credit, I'm sorry. That's a high school thing. Dual language programs that we have now, right? The thinking about language instruction is entirely different and actually addresses that very thing that we have native Spanish speakers spend their day half in Spanish so that they can gain that academic Spanish that they may or may not actually gain at home. So that was one difference. I mean, there's just so many in terms of detail, but I would say it was the difference in terms of English instruction was one of incentive and reward for the German children versus punishment and shame for the Mexican American children. And I detail it in all sorts of different ways, but that's the big structure.
Was there any effort to teach any of the German, probably moms more than children, any Spanish? If they were going to move out into the city and have a maid, again, for labor purposes, or was that not, or do you have any idea? Maybe that's not.
Well, I think they should have been taking Spanish like all the Anglo kids. It was taught for 15 minutes a day at Crockett. I mean, which is where most of them went. So I have no evidence that they were taken out of that. And it was taught by a group of traveling teachers who could actually speak Spanish because most of the teachers at Crockett couldn't. Mm-hmm. And even teachers who had sort of majored in Spanish in high school or in college, or I should say in college, or take it in Spanish, got into the classroom and realized they had not taken it like in the way that like students study it now, right? They didn't feel comfortable teaching Spanish. They realized they had learned Castilian Spanish. They had learned it largely through reading and writing, not through speaking, and not through conversation with actual Spanish speakers. And so they felt ill-prepared, even when sometimes they were thought to have the credentials. And that was actually the biggest obstacle. The district tried not teaching Spanish a lot, and it was Anglo parents who drove the initiative in saying, our kids are going to speak Spanish because otherwise Mexican-American kids are going to be bilingual and our kids are not. And that doesn't work for us. And that wasn't like a progressive cross-cultural argument. That was an economic argument that they were making.
You talked a little bit about the identity, the white identity, and how that's a big part of the connector. Do you think that there was any anti-Semitism involved in the acceptance of these families?
Oh yeah, the ability to look the other way in and of itself was anti-Semitic. They integrated pretty quickly a lot of these families into El Paso churches, which you know, was an important part of their Americanizing themselves and socializing themselves into El Paso society. That's not necessarily anti-Semitic, but they flagged themselves as Christian really pretty quickly, and saw that as an important thing to do. It doesn't mean they didn't also have those religious beliefs, but that was one institution, that and the PTA, where a lot of the families integrated themselves really pretty quickly. But, you know, this is all happening as Jewish refugees are being turned away by the United States. And so I don't have a lot of evidence in terms of anti-Semitic thinking in El Paso in particular, but writ large for sure, right? And this was the State Department's argument because they were trying to deal with refugee problems at the same time that the War Department was taking in former Nazis or Nazis. So, and there is an interesting moment, I guess, in the book where I quote a memoir from Johann Schinkel, the father who was assimilating himself as a Texan, who says, like, I just can't believe how welcoming these Texans are. Even the Jewish merchants downtown love us and are so nice to us. The Jewish merchants they were talking about had rescued their families from the Holocaust. So I'm not sure that was actually what they were feeling, but that was how they were read as emoting.
How many years did most of the families live here, and where did they go next?
That's a really good point.
For years, we had a large German population here through the German Air Force base that was here for many, many years, but I don't know if those are connected or not. So I'm curious how long this particular group stayed in El Paso, and then maybe larger in America. Yeah.
Well, they stayed in America for good. They became American citizens in 1955, almost all of them. The exception being Ilsa Oxter, the teacher, the Montessori teacher, who they refused to give her family citizenship because of her. The New York Times had reported on her. So she was like really an issue. She was a problem in a way that like most of the scientists, no one could even say their names other than like Werner von Braun and a couple, right? But people knew who she was. So they were denied citizenship, but the rest of them were given citizenship within 10 years of being here. But they only stayed in El Paso for 3, at which point they were moved to Huntsville, Alabama, first to work for a different military installation, but then they actually built NASA, or a part of building NASA, and ended their careers really as rocket scientists in terms of the space race, and space scientists more than military scientists. At that point, some of them branched off and just went into other kinds of private industry. They spread out more, but only one family ended up coming back to El Paso. A few stayed in Alamogordo because a lot of the missile work was done at White Sands, and there was a breach within the group. There were several sort of social breaches within the group, but only one family came back to El Paso.
So the YWCA feels it's so important to put on these kinds of programs because of our mission. Our mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And when you were writing this book, because I know you and I know how committed you are to social justice, there had to be moments when you just were like, oh, you know, why didn't we learn that lesson? Why are we still fighting this fight? What are a couple of those moments that popped into your head when you were working on this book?
Oh, that's a good question. In terms of specific moments, you know, I don't know if this is a perfect answer to your or an exact answer to your question, but there's a story at the beginning of chapter 2 of these paperclip children being on the train. So they took a boat from Germany to New York and then had to take the train from New York to El Paso. And being on a train car, obviously north of the Mason-Dixie line, with a Black soldier who offers her a piece of gum. And I won't tell the whole story because for people who have the book and are going to read it, I would blow it. But I would just say it turns into a story of her terrorizing that soldier. And the ways in which she told that story just made me realize I don't think white children are terrorizing, but they have an inordinate amount of power in this culture still. And since you brought up the story of Buffalo, I would just say, like, I think journalists have already started to notice that the shooter has been called a teenager. And then they've posted a whole bunch of other stories of African-American 18-year-olds who have done something and been called Black men, right? And there's just something about our culture that just empowers and I think exploits also for its own uses these images of white children as symbols of the United States, as symbols of democracy, as sort of like the best that our society has to offer.
Racial purity, just like the Nazis were striving for, right? As symbols of some sort of ideal of racial purity.
Yeah. So there are so many stories of that in the book, and there are so many stories of struggling schools that I know are still struggling, and that made me feel that way as well. But I think, like most American historians probably feel, so like to tell American history is in some ways to tell stories of, you know, you wish we could have learned a little bit more from this sometimes. And I guess also to go back, I don't want to end on a completely depressing note. And we've learned some, right? Like, as we talked about earlier, we're not in the same moment. We're facing similar challenges, but we've also, I think, made much greater gains. You know, the good looks so much better than it looked.
Yeah, and I would say that I do think that children, especially white children, are still used as PR pawns, but many of them have become much more aware. And many at a very young age, like you're like you know, Franny and Henry and my kids and Sylvia's daughter Siboney are ready to jump in at a very much younger age than even I was. You know, just they're learning it and they're reading about it and they want a better world for everybody. And that to me is always so encouraging.
Yes, totally. Yeah, when I compare the kids I know now to even just how I was at that age, and I grew up, you know, in a really pretty progressive environment, and a multiracial one as well. Yeah, there's no comparison. It's exciting.
If I could just say something, and I don't want to bring it back to negative, but one of the things that for me was most striking about listening to this was the stories that I've heard from people that spoke Spanish in school in El Paso, and the fact that they were hit, they were treated terribly, and then to hear that in another world, speaking Spanish meant, or speaking English in class rather than German, meant getting an ice cream. And for me, and then the secondary part of that, which was teaching Spanish to children so that they could learn how to speak to their servants. Like that for me was it really, I think, highlighted the reason why we need to have these types of programs. Because unless we know our history, unless we know those things that have occurred and the way that education, the way that books, the way that punishment, what I would call punishment, was utilized in schools and in systems to perpetuate this very racist and I think classist behavior is something that allows us to kind of take a step back. And I had never, honestly, I had never thought like, what would be the opposite of hitting a child because they spoke Spanish? Never would I have thought that in the educational system that the opposite of that could be, let's reward children for speaking English by giving them ice cream. That never even came into my brain. And I don't know if anybody who's watching this, if that ever came into the brain, because all we've heard is the stories of Mexican children being punished for speaking Spanish, but there was never a positive reinforcement for speaking English. So that was a lot for me. I had to take a step back and just like breathe when I heard that. But I want to thank you for bringing that to light, because you don't know which part of your words are going to really make an impact with somebody. And I really am so appreciative of this book. I'm appreciative of the words you shared with us, about your spirit and your heart that you've shared with us. And Ann Horak, you are just a rock star at asking these amazing questions and just making sure that we're all involved. I just want to thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I want to invite those of you that participate in our Courageous Conversations to invite a friend. Our next Courageous Conversation is going to also be one that I think is going to be very interesting. Anne, you want to talk a little bit about that one, and then we'll move forward.
Yes, we're working on one for probably early fall on the rise of anti-Semitism. We had originally thought about combining it with Jonna, but Jonna's book has got so much interesting information, and I really encourage everybody to read the entire book. You can get it off Amazon, but don't do that. Buy local. Go to Literarity. If you've never been to the Literarity bookstore, you're in for a real treat. It's a great local bookstore here in El Paso on the west side in Pepper Tree Square. But the rise of anti-Semitism, just as we've seen the rise of racial attacks on so many groups here in El Paso, on our own, this is part of our El Paso history now too, being the victims of a racist attack in Buffalo, attacks on Indigenous persons, and attacks on Asian Americans. And we've seen more and more attacks on Jewish persons. Anti-Semitism did not start with World War II, and it did not end with World War II. It has been with us for most of our history. So we're going to have representatives from the El Paso Holocaust Museum, from Temple Mount Sinai, and also from the Anti-Defamation League. So keep an eye out for that panel that will be coming up probably in early fall.
So with that, I want to thank Dr. Perrillo for being with us today, for participating in our Courageous Conversation. I want to thank Dr. Ann Horak for being a part of this amazing project that we dreamt about 3 years ago, and it's really taken off. And also Kayla Suarez, who always does a great job of keeping us on track and making sure that we're answering those questions. So remember, YWCA is here, and we are here, and we have lots of committees where you can participate. So if you're an interested member of the community and you're thinking to yourself, that YWCA, they're awesome, because that's what I think. You may want to just say, hey, how can I participate? Are there committees that I can participate in? And we would love to have you. So with that, thank you all very, very much for joining us. Thank you to our amazing speakers, and thank you to our community for caring and for listening and for learning and for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining.